All right, folks, greetings. This is Scott with the Game Audio Institute, and this is continuing our another lovely series in audio scripting shorts. We're not scripting shorts, but we're scripting audio. And what we're doing is we're dealing in Unity. We are part 3 of our footsteps, and basically this one's going to be all about the scripting portion of the endeavor, effectively, and we'll see how far we get in this part. But anyway, basically, I want to give you a little bit more review because this is the Game Audio Institute channel. We throw things into context. We don't just dump you into the ocean and let you figure things out. Okay, so what happens is we're going to basically take a look at the context of what we're dealing with. What we are dealing with is third-person shooter footsteps, which is basically going to use physics, and switching, which is basically based on a tag identifier, essentially. Now, there's lots of different ways to approach this, of course, as we know. We're going to be using the animation event one, basically, okay? So that means that when the foot is physically sort of looking like it's touching the ground, that's when we would play our footstep. All right, and we tested all this stuff out to some degree correctly, okay? Last time we did this. But anyway, let's just sort of take a look at what we're going to have to do in order to really have this work, okay? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to basically checking to make sure that the player is on the ground and that they're moving past a certain speed, basically, okay? They have to be on the ground and moving past a certain speed. And then once those conditions are met, right? So in other words, this is what happens when we get the animation event, right? It comes into here, it hits this, and then it's going to basically get a list of audio clips based on the surface of whatever it happens to be walking on. And what we're going to do in that particular case is we're going to basically create a variable that is in itself a list of audio clips, and then we're going to basically return that list. And then this script is going to have this list in its hand, and then at that point, it will just select a random clip from that list and play the clip, which is identical to what we were already doing with the list, seeing things from a list or playing things randomly. So it's pretty much identical as far as the methods are being concerned. Let's switch over to Unity and take a look at what things we're going to need to know in order to be able to make sure that these conditions, player on the ground and moving past a certain speed, are being met, okay? And then we'll go into the scripting from there. All right, so take a look over here. The first thing that we need to know is whether the player is on the ground. Now, we actually have an automatic situation here under our player armature object that's here inside Unity. And what happens is, if we take a look over here in our third-person controller script, okay, all the way down here, we have a player grounded section, in fact, actually, which has a very clear Boolean, or, true or false. Basically, it's a check mark in this case, right? So it's basically going to say, okay, if it's grounded, then this is going to be checked, which means it's a yes, not a no, okay? So that is one thing that we can do. And we actually, if you can recall, if we look at our previous script and stuff like that, you can actually see that we've created a variable already, a public variable that was already set with the third-person controller as the variable, and then we're basically looking for the grounded parameter on that, essentially on that component, effectively, which is called a public variable. And when they're public, then you can use them in other scripts. If they weren't public, if they were private, you couldn't do so. You could only use them in their own internal scripts. Anyway, so the next thing we need to do is we need to check the speed, and we can actually do that here on our animator. So our animator, if we remember, I can go all the way back to our base layer if we want to. So that's going to be over here, base layer, and essentially over here, then you're going to go over here to the parameters. So there's layers, there's the base layer. We can go over here if we want to look what we were looking at before, but really what we want is the list of parameters. And the parameters actually has a parameter here called speed. So if we basically get a variable from this animator, remember the animator has to be where we are calling our public void for our animation events, right? So if we call that public function effectively for animation events, it has to be on the same object that the animator is on, or else it won't work, essentially. If we had a script, we could potentially also say maybe it could be on a different object, but it eventually has to pass the message on to the object that has the animator on it, okay? So anyway, at this point in time, that's exactly what we did. We put everything here on player armature, if you can remember that. All right, now let's go over here to the scripting and see how we're going to use those variables in the results. All right. So when we're here, we're going to basically be looking at, essentially these variables for the animator and for the what's the other thing that we're going to be doing? Yeah, the animator and also the third-person controller. So let's take the third-person controller first. We're going to basically call that a player. So what we could do is we could certainly say, okay, remember we want to check to see if certain conditions are true. So we can stick this whole thing and say, if player, and it's automatically there, it's called is grounded. And I believe that's, let me just make sure about if I've got that correctly. Yep, that's right, grounded. It's actually player grounded, not is grounded, grounded. So remember that whenever we have this, by the way, player dot grounded. So essentially what this is saying is that this is a variable that is part of the third-person controller. Now, what happened was our third-person controller was called player, right? And so we had it publicly variable, so we could drag the object over it and use its third-person controller. We could manually also make connections directly to the third-person controller on this object by saying get component third-person controller, but it's okay. We can do it this way. I wanted to show you a different variety of different ways to do it. So if player.grounded, okay, that means if this is true, basically. If player.grounded is true, okay? If I wanted to say if it was not true, if I say wanted to have a jump sound that would play, or maybe some kind of sound that would play while I was flying around in the air, maybe in that case I would go over here and I would say if not player grounded, which means I would put a exclamation point in front of it, and that would make it an opposite thing. But in this case, I want this to be the truth. Now, the other thing is I want both conditions to be true. Now, what's the other condition that I want? I want the animation speed to be past a certain point. Well, okay, so the animation speed requires the component called the animator. Now, I could have decided to say public animator something or another, but I'm going to, like I say, I'm trying to show you guys different options here. So we're going to basically call this, we're going to basically declare a variable inside this function rather than inside the whole script. If you declare it inside the whole script, then it's available to any function inside the script. In this case, we don't really care. We can make this function only available in this function only. So in other words, if we declare a variable here, it's only going to be good within the brackets of this function, basically. So I'm going to call this animator. I don't need to call it public because it won't work anyway. I call this animator. Sorry. Animator. And you can call this anything you want. It could be called Bob or Lollipop or SpongeBob, anything you want, basically. So basically you can do this, and you can say get. And remember, this is exactly the method we showed you in one of the scripting videos for triggers, I think. And so basically what happens is we go get component, animator. Yep, and we put that all in the less than and greater than brackets, right? And then, of course, the famous parentheses at the end, and, of course, the semicolon. So now we're going to say animator, animator, get component, animator. That means basically look for a component called animator on the game object that this script is on, okay? Then we're going to be looking for the speed control on that animator. In other words, a parameter that's available on that parameter. So we're going to say here, float, which is basically declaring a floating number, floating point number. We're going to call this move speed. Right? And that's going to be called animator. Again, that's our variable that we're using, our instance, if you will, that we've created of this particular script. I'm going to call it get float, which basically means get a parameter that is a float parameter by name in this case. We can get it in a couple different ways, but one of the ways is by name. So we would basically put in quotes what parameter we want. And we just have to know the exact way that that parameter is made. So in other words, we can't use a lowercase s if the parameter shows up as an uppercase s, for example. It shows up as an uppercase s for now, which is why we have to do it this way. Then we go, there we go. So now it's get float speed, move speed, animator, get float speed. So that means it's going to get the parameter speed, get the variable at that exact time, okay, at exactly that time. whenever it happens to be called. So now we're going to say if player grounded and to do any sort of conditional stuff, you use the doubles. So double and then you say move speed. So move speed in this case should be greater than 1.0 f. And I just know this because I've done a little bit of research on this thing and found out that the walk speed is supposed to be somewhere around 2. So anything over 1 means you're heading off towards walking and moving, basically. So that's pretty accurate overall. So in this case, we're going to say a player grounded and move speed is 1.0 f. Now, in that case, what happens is now we do want to create another set of brackets and put all of this stuff inside those brackets. Okay? So now what we have is the ability for this basically to check to see if the player is grounded and if the move speed is greater than 1.0 f, basically. And that is what we're basically looking for, is the speed control on there and saying, okay, well, if you're basically moving a little bit, then you must be wanting to play, wanting to do footsteps, essentially. And so that's basically how we're gonna handle that, essentially. Now, we're going to then get a few other things going on here too. So right now, this is still just going to say find one single footstep sound and play the footstep sound. We don't want to do that. We want to actually do it in a different way. But we want to get into some other stuff. And for that, we probably need to start thinking about, probably, we'll see what happens on this one. Let's just talk about returning a variable of some kind or another. Now, we are going to have to probably create, some more stuff here. We already have created inside our script those tile steps, the footsteps, the metal steps, stuff like that. We are going to need a string here that is going to be available that will be public, which we're going to call surface. So we're going to call this one public string for surface, and you'll see why we're going to need this in a little bit. Public string surface, because we need to know what surface we're on, right? And so that's going to be an important kind of thing that we're going to want, and we're going to use this for sure. And okay, so there's start. And what we can do if we want to say the third person controller thing, if you don't want to drag it in there, even though it's a public variable, you could actually say here in start, if you felt like doing that, you could say public third person controller. Actually, you could just say, what was it called? Player, right? So it was called player. So we're going to say player equals, once again, good old get component. It's a really convenient one to use, actually. And it's also very recommended, usually. So get component, and in this case, we're going to call this third person controller. And we have to do it by making sure that we have those starter assets. Remember we talked about that whole thing? The starter assets had to be put in there. If you just automatically declare a third person controller out of nowhere, it's going to wonder what the heck you're doing. So we don't want to do that. Okay, so we're going to say player get component equals third person controller. So this way we don't have to actually drag an object over there. It will just happen at the beginning of the game. All right, folks, that's all for this particular installment. I hope you have learned a little bit of stuff. We're definitely going to get much more into even more stuff because this is a bit deep. This is a bit more in depth, so we're really going to have to be working on things for a couple more weeks. It looks like at this point in time, maybe 1, maybe 2 more weeks. All right, so we'll see you again next week. If you like this video, leave a like, leave a comment, share it, subscribe if you're interested, and obviously if you feel like funding us at all, you can on Patreon, you can get access to these scripts and our projects and stuff like that. Some of our projects anyway, for free if you want to. So think about signing up if you want. So we'll see you next time, and I hope this helps you get your game audio on, and we'll see you again. Take care. Bye.